Okay, I'd now like to introduce Rafal Chomik from the University of New South Wales, and his presentation is entitled Gender Inequality and Pension System Design. So Rafal.
Thank you very much, and thank you to COTA for inviting me to be part of this really very important conversation. I've also really enjoyed a lot of the presentations. They've been really fascinating. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the pension system design itself. A lot of people have already covered some of the topics that I'll talk about, but I'll put some numbers onto some of that. I'll talk about the pension system. I'll just introduce it very briefly. Then I'll talk about how that inequality does accumulate over the life cycle using specific examples, and then some policy measures as well. So you're familiar with the two pillars of the pension system. When talking about pension systems, we tend to divide them up functionally. So there's the adequacy pillar, which is the age pension in Australia, and the income replacement pillar in Australia is superannuation. Now, different countries have different levels of importance on those pillars. So, for example, in New Zealand, you have a very large adequacy pillar, which is a universal age pension that everyone gets all the way up the income distribution, and not very much income replacement. In the US, you have a government-run income replacement scheme and a very, very small safety net first pillar. In Australia, they're more or less balanced currently, but we'll talk about how they play out. One of the things to say, actually, is that it's the second pillar that gets a lot of the governments in trouble in fiscal terms, especially in a lot of European countries. That's because they've made promises across the income distribution to people who are worse off as well as better off. And then when you get population aging, that has an impact on budgets. In Australia, the sustainability is much better. We're the third lowest spending OECD country on pensions when talking about just the age pension. So let's have a look at these. A very large proportion of the over 65-year-old population gets the age pension, so about 3/4, and you can see that on the left, in the left chart. In terms of super, you can see that accumulation there, and people have talked about the numbers already, that men at 60 to 64 have an accumulation of about 200,000 compared to women who have about 100,000. A lot of that is historic, so one of the things to note is that the women who are 60 to 64, other people have talked about this, haven't been part of the labour market very much in the past. And also, they haven't accumulated very much superannuation because it's only been running really in full 9% mode since 2002. And in fact, if you look at the 2004 figures, it's a much lower level of accumulation. Also, the gap was larger, so it's about 60% in 2004 at 60 to 64, and it's about 50% now. But a lot of that is historic. So what I actually want to do for the rest of the talk is talk about what would happen to an individual who would enter the labour market now. So someone who's 20 years old is entering the labour market. What are their prospects in future based on their experiences in the labour market? So if you take a base case, so someone who's on a male, on average earnings, about 80,000, they can expect to get 11,000 or so of their age pension and 36,000 of super, retiring on about 47,000. Now, this is based on standard assumptions of investment, inflation, and things like that. It's also presented in today's earnings terms, so it's adjusted for wages. That level seems reasonable. It's above the ASFA threshold for a comfortable retirement. So that's what that full-time, full-career male would get. Now, we've heard from other presenters that there is this wage gap, and it's about 17%. And that wage gap, so a woman who's on average earnings would be on 66,000. A proportion of that age gap is due to the segregation that you get within the labour market, so women being in certain industries and certain occupations. Another part of it, about 70% of it, is due to no other explanation but the fact that they're a woman. So if you were to model that, someone who's on 70% of that total gender gap would be on 70,000. And so you can already see a very big drop, mainly because she's a woman in retirement incomes. Also, that gap should be multiplied out over the course of the retirement, because I'm presenting the income per year rather than the assets themselves. So if you then take the second part of that gender pay gap, which is due to segregation, you see the drop again. Then if the woman needs to leave the labour force to care for children, if she takes 3 years out, and you can see that this is actually data before the paid parental leave came in the current setting in 2005. So a lot of women do come back to the labour market within about 4 to 6 months, but many don't, and those ones are on casual and contract basis. So it's not unreasonable to suggest that 3 years out of the labour market is something that a woman would do. So then you can see that drop again in the accumulation and in the income. Then, when she goes back to the labour market, she might go back part-time, and that's quite common. You can see on the chart on the right, the proportion of women who have children have much higher rates of participation in the labour market, which is part-time. Then, when she goes back to the labour market, she might go back part-time, and that's quite common. You can see on the chart on the right, the proportion of women who have children have much higher rates of participation in the labour market, which is part-time, compared to women who have no children and men. So if you were to put that into the model, you get a drop again in her income in retirement. When she does go back, she tends to often suffer a wage penalty. So the research seems to show that her trajectory of earnings is actually, after the third year of being back after maternity leave, is over 10% lower compared to someone who doesn't leave, a woman who doesn't leave the maternity. So I've modelled that as a 10% lower level of earnings for the rest of her trajectory in the labour force. And you see again that drop. Then we've talked about the fact that women tend to also care for their partners, and this is part of this sandwich generation that we hear about. What I've done is show you a chart that shows the cohabiting primary carers' age across the bottom, and then the people who they're caring for across the y-axis. So it shows you that someone who's in their 40s and 50s is caring still a little bit for children, but is beginning to also care for her spouse and his spouse. And also for parents. So if you were to model someone leaving the labour force at 55 to work part-time, you get, again, about $1,000 drop in retirement income. And imagine all those sorts of things, all those career breaks, if someone is actually on the minimum wage. So this is a woman working on minimum wage, again with those sorts of breaks. And we know that women tend to be more likely to work on a minimum wage. So that's a quick exercise to show you what some of that impact that we've talked about is. How do we build that back up? I'll talk about it in a moment. But one of the things to notice is that as superannuation reduces, the age pension increases. And that's the means test doing the work. So in fact, some of that, some of the labour market inequalities is actually being offset by the pension system design that we have in Australia, this means test that we have, but not all of it. The other thing to notice that's part of it is that the replacement rate is higher the lower down you go in income. So replacement rate is the level of income that you get in retirement compared to the level of income that you have before you leave for retirement in work. So if you look at the male on 80,000, his replacement rate is about 60% compared to what he gets in retirement, whereas the woman at the bottom, it gets almost 100% replacement rate. And that's that pension system design that's making this happen. The other thing about this is that perhaps it would be okay if within a household women decide that they're going to do the work, and this is the thing that Ben talked about, and men doing the work in the labour market. But we know that marriage rates are much lower than they used to be, and that divorce rates are much higher than they used to be. So it isn't the case that they might be sharing that income in retirement. So how do we build this back up? How do we go from the bottom and back up to the gap that we have with the male? Well, a lot of people have talked about the various things within the labour market, and I think a lot of it would be within the labour market. But then there's the various things that the pension system can do, and this is the private savings part that we talked about in terms of the credits in the last presentation, and then supporting the outcomes themselves with the age pension. And I'll talk about just the three of them quickly. So here's the base case again. This is the woman on 66,000, the average female. If you were to increase the overall contributions, now this isn't dealing with the gap itself, but dealing with the adequacy, the amount of income that she might get in retirement. One way to do it is in fact to work longer. And so we've seen in the budget recently that there's this increase to age 70. It's controversial. We don't know whether the women will be able to work that much longer and whether the labour market will be there. But it would mean higher levels of income in retirement, and that's just a way of enumerating it there. However, one of the things that we've also seen in the budget is a delay to the increase to contributions going up to 12%. And that actually has an impact for our 20-year-olds going into the labour market today. And this isn't cumulative, so this is just in comparison to the first point there. And so you can see a drop just because we're delaying when employers are going to increase contributions. Another area is tax treatment. So historically, as income increases, you pay more taxes, and that's the marginal tax rate on income. Contributions when going into superannuation have always been 15%. Now, most of the time have been 15%. So that seemed a little bit unfair to when Henry Review was looking at it and said, well, people who have a higher marginal rate get a big discount to their tax, whereas people towards the bottom don't. In fact, they pay a higher level of tax than they would be if they were getting it in income. So they suggested that it's linked to the marginal tax rate, the contribution rate, and that's a 15% less than the marginal rate. And that was a way of making it more progressive. So we saw in Labour's budget 2012 that they were going sort of towards that. There was some administrative issues in how they were going about it, but they set it up so that they introduced what's called the low-income superannuation contribution at the bottom, which offset the tax rate increase. And they increased the rate of tax contribution for people over 300,000. And what we saw in the last budget is actually going back to where we were before. So it seems like a regressive move. So what does that mean for our individual? Well, this time I'm taking someone who's on 30,000, the minimum wage person, working a full career, no breaks in this case. Because she's losing that low-income superannuation contribution, that offset for the higher tax, in fact, the outcome for retirement income is a drop. If you compare that to someone who's on 300,000, you've introduced a regressive measure within the budget, which means that the tax rate reduces for someone who's on that income. So that might be perhaps an area that the government will want to revisit in the tax review that it's doing towards the end of the year. Now, what was decided in the Harmer review in 2009 was that the level of the age pension was too low. So what they did was introduce something like this, which was to increase the level of the maximum, but make the taper more aggressive. To make the taper more aggressive, it meant that it didn't go as far up the income distribution, which meant that they could do it, increase the age pension without making it cost more. And it was quite a clever move. What we actually saw in the last budget is the introduction of indexation to prices. Now, because all this is presented in wages terms, prices grow slower than wages, which means that the effect for our 20-year-old is actually a very big drop in wages terms that person can expect in retirement from the age pension. So the impact on the person on 66,000 is actually a big drop in the age pension. Now, I should have really presented here the various career breaks as well on top of that. But you can see from the previous chart that the maximum that the person would be able to get is about 11,000, 12,000 from the age pension. So that prospect is concerning. And I don't know whether we're appreciating the impact that this would have in changing the importance of the different pillars within the Australian system. So, in conclusion, We can see how gender inequality does accumulate over the life cycle through the pension system. How the pension system does offset it to some extent. How most of it really must be within the earnings side, within the labour market, and we've heard from other presenters on that. But the pension system could do more, and could do that within with one eye on sustainability in terms of how the progressivity of taxes is arranged, and in terms of how the pension means test is arranged, perhaps even thinking about how the home is set within the asset test as well. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.